In the first two episodes, we had seen the start of the story of Europe and Napoleon, looking at how the military prodigy would be able to develop, as well as some of the factors that had gone into his success. We had seen some of the events that had constituted his time in power, some of the battles he would come to take a part in, and some of the consequences of those battles. We started with a look at the world of Corsica from 1769 and the experiences the island would go through as time moved forward. We had also looked at the young Napoleon's life, from his time in education at École Militaire and the flashes of what was to come, that would show themselves at various points in time there, to even the regions that Napoleon would pass through at this early stage of his life, regions and areas the likes of Valence and Auxonne. We had also looked at the influence of Paoli, the man who had played a role in the life of Napoleon and that of his father. Paoli would want Corsica to secede. Pasquale Paoli had led a life that had seen many events take place. At some point in time, he would find himself exiled to Britain. At another point in time, he would find himself involved in events that would have ramifications for him, an expedition to Sardinia in which Napoleon was also involved. Some other point in time would also see Corsica under control by some of his supporters. He had been born around 1725 and would live a relatively long life, seeing him wear several roles that included those of the military leader as well as those of the statesman. Some of the events that would occur during his lifetime would include events like the Battle of Ponte Novo. He had come to interact with the Napoleon family several times, though some souring of the relationship would occur at another and would take place around the time that he would be exiled to England. Pasquale Paoli had been born into a family in which he wouldn't be the only son, and his father had been involved in the Corsican nationalist movement. Several issues had surrounded the Genoan government in control of Corsica at the time, and a rebellion would find itself taking place in the year 1729. His father would go into exile at some point in time, and along with him would be at least one of his sons, Pasquale. Several episodes would happen during this period that would have a bearing on the future. Pasquale would find himself involved in several events during this period. He would eventually find himself as General-in-Chief of Corsica, commander of all resistance. Several other events would occur in the wake of this one, and would include a constitution and many other modifications. He would find himself in England after some of these events, where many other events would occur. Included in them was his meetings with numerous individuals who would continue to play a role in his life. Changes would transpire that would allow Paoli to return home, during which time he would find himself become the president. He would implement many changes within the Republic. Other events would occur during this period comprising the War of the Austrian Succession. 1793. Events would occur that would improve Napoleon's standing with individuals like Augustin Robespierre. For one, Napoleon would be involved in events that would surround the port of Toulon and attempts to recover it. He occupied the position of artillery commander of the Republican forces that had been given some responsibility in regard to Toulon. He made changes that would lead to the success of the attempt. Bonaparte would also find himself involved in an event that would have a bearing for Paoli, the French expedition to Sardinia. By the end of events, Corsica would be controlled by Paoli's supporters. Several promotions would follow Napoleon. One of them would see him become artillery commander of the Army of Italy, his plans proving effective and granting a triumph. 1793 would also see the siege of Toulon, a battle that would play a noteworthy role in creating the reputation of Napoleon. It would see the destruction of several ships, as well as the involvement of several individuals, amongst whom were the likes of Sir Sidney Smith, Samuel Hood, and Charles O'Hara, the last one of whom would be captured. Events would eventually see the entry of convention troops into Toulon. This would occur around mid to late December. 1793 would see the siege of Toulon occur. It would see the involvement of soldiers of the French Republic, royalist rebels, and soldiers from Anglo-Spanish troops in a tactical and strategized struggle that would take place over the course of months, involve several casualties and many backs and forths in a clash that would have important ramifications. Strategies and plans would also emerge over the course of the battles as circumstances changed, positions and strategic points were achieved, men were captured, negotiations were opened, and new batteries were built. At some point in time, the French would launch an attack on Little Gibraltar. They would gain new locations, but this progress would not be without cost for the French. The events that would occur in the siege of Toulon would be important for several reasons. Not least of all was the tactical importance that the port of Toulon played, as well as the ships that had been present there, ships that would eventually find themselves being destroyed. Before the events that had happened, several occurrences had taken place, including the arrest of several individuals. Some of these episodes would lead to unrest. The unrest would occur across several French cities. Toulon would see numerous episodes occur in it and also see the Jacobin Club evicted, the rise of the Royalists, and the entrance of troops in support from the Anglo-Spanish fleet. This would see the involvement of a man known as Baron Xavier Lebré d'Imbert and British and Spanish admirals, including Sir Samuel Hood. Several events would occur which would lead to the rising of the French royal flag. Amidst some of the events that would occur at Toulon, the fort would be given over to the British Navy. Conflict over the port, with all its importance, would also come about. This conflict would see the involvement of many individuals from various places and with different agendas. Into this situation, with the escalating tension, and with many things riding on it, would enter the French Republicans along with several notable individuals. Amongst them were Jean-François Cartos, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Jean-François Cornu de la Poype. In the course of events that would occur, Napoleon would be involved in several events, including those that would see the French build several batteries that were there to challenge those that were in possession and in use by the British. The events would also see him involved in some of the attacks, which would eventually see him injured in the fighting at one point in time. Several other individuals would also play a part or role in the events that would unfold over the course of the siege. Many events would occur which would call for changes in tact when things went wrong for one or the other side. It even saw changes in personnel over the course of the siege. The eventual result of the siege would be French Republican victory. But many other events would occur during the course of the siege. We will take some time to explore a bit of the events as well as their importance to the overall wars. We will also look at how they would come to play a role in the overall outcomes of the siege. And in addition, explore the role that Napoleon would come to play in the events. Toulon would be an important region for several reasons, including its ships and other factors. It would be especially important for the Republicans in some of what they aimed to achieve. By the end of the events that would occur in the episode prior to the siege, Toulon would raise the royal flag. It is thus how we arrive at events that would occur during the siege and would see the reaction of the Republic to the events. We will also look at the involvement of Napoleon. Toulon would see the arrival of several troops, amongst whom were the troops under leaders like Jean-François Cornu de la Poype. On the British side, the batteries that were there were Fort Mulgrave, St. Philippe, St. Come, and Saint-Charles, and they would collectively be called Little Gibraltar. The French, on the other hand, initially had the mountain, but with time and through the efforts of the French, amongst whom would be Napoleon, playing an important part and active role, some more batteries would be added to it. These batteries would include those called Sans-Culottes, Jacobin, Men Without Fear, and Chassé-Kicking. The present Bonaparte would make moves to acquire more equipment. This would be aided by supplies and additional men from the surrounding population, which was in part thanks to the influence of some of Bonaparte's friends. Another event that would occur would be the sending of a letter of appeal to the Committee of Public Safety by Napoleon, in which he asked for help. He would spend some time planning and coming up with ideas. Some of the plans which would involve actions that were designed to reduce and block some of the supplies for Toulon, as usually occurred in a siege. In addition to some of the actions that Bonaparte had done above, Bonaparte would also find himself playing an active part in the fighting. He would even find himself being injured at a later point in time. Events would see the replacement of Cartos by François-Amédée d'Oppet, but he would in turn be replaced by de Gamier, a man who had been active within the French army for years. De Gamier had been born in 1738. In his career, he would find himself associated with naval batteries at least one point in time. Under him, several batteries would be added and constructed, and conflicts would continue. At a point in time, the Anglo-Neapolitans would be able to attack, capturing a battery. A counterattack from Bonaparte's side would follow. During some of these events, a British general would be captured. He would go by the name of General Charles O'Hara, and his capture would lead or at least contribute to several events. Amongst some of the events would be negotiations. The Republicans would attack in December during the night, leading to the capture of several positions, but in the fighting Bonaparte would be injured. Evacuation would be the decision of the Allies. This would also involve a decision to take steps in order to destroy ships that were present, which had so much importance to the French. Without the ships, their challenge of British naval power would be at least weakened. The French were aware of this importance. Events would see the involvement of several individuals, amongst who were people the likes of Longara, Charles O'Hara, and Smith. Though some challenges would be encountered during some of the events. At some point in time, the ship HMS Vulcan would be utilized as a fire ship as it was set to the flame. Other ships that would be targeted during this period would include a ship that had been previously captured. Added to this as well were some French ships that found themselves present there during the events that had occurred. Amongst some of them would be the Montreal. Some of the ships of the British side that would be present and play somewhat of an active role in the events that would occur would include the Britannia and the Union. Things would see several casualties in an event that would see shots fired and structures and buildings set aflame. At one point in time, the Iris would explode, and in the events surrounding it, several individuals would lose their lives on the ship Union. Also present during some of these events would be Republican prisoners who would play an active role in some of the proceedings of the episode. Forces against the Republicans would at some point in time turn their attention towards the old arsenal, aiming to set ships within it also aflame. But they would be stopped by several factors, including the presence of Republican forces. Smith, who would be present and involved in some of these events, would at some point in time decide to withdraw from Toulon. Several individuals would be able to leave and evacuate from Toulon. Numerous changes would occur in the aftermath, including Napoleon's departure to take up a new role. In the third and fourth videos, we took a short look at the Battle of Austerlitz, seeing some of the events that had occurred surrounding it. From the individuals invested in the events, the likes of Michael Mela, Louis Dezay, and Napoleon Bonaparte, to the areas that would see the fighting. The battle had seen the involvement of several troops and had seen doubts form in the minds of certain individuals, amongst whom was Emperor Francis. After it, the Peace of Pressburg about come to be. Prior to this peace, other treaties had been signed, included amongst which were the Treaty of Campo Formio and the Treaty of Luneville. But the peace would be destined to be broken at some point in time in the future. Many factors would remain preventing peace from being realized. In addition to these changes, some of which would come in the future, was the Confederation of the Rhine. In the period before the battle, Austria had recently implemented changes within its army, and at the helm of some of these changes would be a man known as Karl Mack. The Allies' numbers would be bolstered by arriving troops, and Napoleon would be planning for a possible invasion of England, something that wouldn't ultimately happen. The army that would be amassed would be known as the Army of England or the Armée d'Angleterre, and would consist of several people, all with various origins and stories behind their lives. The treaty that would be signed after would signal territorial impacts and lead to many changes that would come to impact several persons across a large territory. Other changes that would come as a result of the battle or would be contributed to by some of its outcomes would include the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine. Prior to the battle, several other events had occurred throughout the European continent, with many clashes occurring over a space of time. Amongst some of these battles would be battles like the Battle of Valmy, the Siege of Mainz, the Battle of Arlon, and the Siege of Toulon. These had come to constitute some of the battles of the War of the First Coalition. Another event that had occurred and that we had covered in the third and fourth episodes had been the Battle of Jena Austedt in 1806. It ended in victory for the French forces, in a conflict that would see fierce fighting and would also result in important changes in territory. The aftermath of the battles would also see massive changes and promotions for certain people, including Marshal Davout, who would gain some acclaim in the conflict. Some of the changes that would occur here would remain in effect until well into the future. We had also taken a look at the Battle of Friedland in 1807, which would see the contribution of the French Empire and the Russian Empire in an encounter that would end in French victory. The events would occur sometime in June and would see the involvement of several individuals, amongst them Michel Ney and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. On the Russian side, individuals like Bennigsen would be involved. The triumph would in time see the Russians withdraw. Discussions would occur after, and the treaties of Tilsit would result. Territorial changes would also take place in the aftermath of the Battle of Friedland. Prior to these events, the Battle of Eylau had occurred. Tensions had also risen in the time before the battle, the tensions being between France and Prussia. At some point in time, the Prussians had made demands of the French, amongst which were a demand that they withdraw from certain areas. Other events would also occur, like the 1806 Battle of Jena-Eistedt, which had ended in victory for the French forces. It was a conflict that would see fierce fighting and would also result in important changes in territory. The aftermath of the battles would also see massive changes in promotions for certain people, including Marshal Davout, who would gain some acclaim in the conflict. Some of the changes that would occur here would remain in effect until well into the future. At some points in time, the Prussian forces would be slow to react, leading to massive losses, and Napoleon at these points in time would be able to gain important victories. At other points, some of the troops under Davout and Bernadotte would be asked to join those of Napoleon. By the end of the Battle of Jena, the Prussians would have lost many men, the French would have won a considerable triumph. Several individuals on the Prussian side would be captured and kept as prisoners. Events at the Battle of Eylau would involve conflicts between forces under Bennigsen and the French troops in a fierce battle that would be hampered in some way by the weather. It would see massive casualties on either side. Present during the battle would be several significant persons who would continue to play varied roles in the way the events unfolded on the day, in a battle that would involve formations, strategies, and struggles in a complex web of events that would see the lives of several and numerous individuals influenced. Whether they were there on the battlefield, actively participating in the conflict, or they were home taking part in the war. The fate of many would depend on some of the actions that would occur at the Battle of Eylau, and some of the events would have an aftermath that would continue to have an effect on many other situations. Following the events of the Battle of Eylau, the Battle of Heilsberg would occur sometime after, and would play its own part in the Napoleonic Wars. It would follow other events like the Siege of Danzig, which had seen the involvement of Friedrich Adolf von Graf Kalkreuth, as well as the French represented by individuals like François-Joseph Lefebvre. Other events that had occurred in the general period had seen the involvement of Ney, as was seen in the Battle of Gutstadt-Diepen, which would occur in June, a battle that would see numerous events occur in the course of its duration. Events would see Ney escape from a conflict that had involved the likes of Levin August von Bennigsen. Ney had found himself outnumbered in this battle, but had still been able to make a showing of it. Russia had made plans concerning Ney and his forces prior to this battle. Some of the events surrounding and involving it had seen the participation of several individuals and locations. Now at the Battle of Friedland, whose general outcomes would be a massive loss for the Russian forces, who would be forced into a retreat. The fighting would see the forces fight and race for certain positions at some points in time during the conflicts, and would see the participation of personalities like Grouchy and Nansouty, as well as those like Lannes. Napoleon would give orders to Ney at certain points in time, as he had at many times during the course of the wars, and these instructions would have a general impact on the outcomes of the battle. Dupont would also play a role in the events of the battle. The French casualties would be less than those of the Russians. One of the strengths of Napoleon's armies was its mobility. This would come to play a role at certain parts of the conflict like it had at other critical battles that had preceded it, giving key advantages that could be used to overcome the opponent. The ensuing negotiations at Tilsit would see many important changes and would see impactful discussions occur between several parties. Amongst them would be Napoleon and Alexander I. Another topic of the third and fourth episodes would have been the Battle of Aspern-Essling. The battle would occur in the year of 1809 and would see the participation of several central figures, amongst who was Napoleon himself, André Massena, Archduke Charles, and Johann von Hiller. The outcomes of the fateful and important battle would be the triumph of Austria. The fighting would see both sides fatigued after having fought with much determination and strength. The defeat would be an anomaly in an otherwise previously successful military campaign under Napoleon, which had seen relatively few defeats for him. At least one other defeat for the French Republic had come in the form of the Battle of Trafalgar, which had transpired in October of 1805. Many casualties would come as a result of this conflict at the Battle of Aspern-Essling, with a notable loss for Napoleon being a man by the name of Marshal Jean-Lannes. Other individuals who would fall due to the conflict would include Louis Vincent Joseph Leblanc de Saint-Hilaire. Fighting would be fierce, with both sides showing strength and determination. Prior to the battle, Napoleon's choice to move his forces across the bridge would be a perilous move that he knew could go wrong. The battle at Aspern-Essling would be different in some ways to other battles that had occurred. For example, the Battle of Austerlitz, whose events would occur in the wake of years of war on the European continent, and the Battle of Marengo. A battle that had ended with French victory would involve some persons and would see fierce fighting. The Battle of Marengo would see the involvement of the French Republic, on whose side were individuals the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Desaix, Jean-Lannes, and the Habsburg monarchy, on whose side was Michael Melas. At the end of the fighting there would be talks, which would see the involvement of Melas, and would see the Austrians withdraw from some of the regions they were in. Other benefits would come from the Battle of Marengo, including an enhancement in Napoleon's political position and an improvement in the way that some people viewed him. It would also grant him more power from which he could carry out some of the things he had wanted to achieve. The French forces would eventually have to withdraw. An event known as the Battle of Wagram would, however, follow in the months that followed, and would see Napoleon and his forces once again try to cross. 1812. 1812 would see the Battle of Borodino, a part of the French conflict with Russia. It ended in victory for the French and would see massive territorial losses for Russia. But the battle would also be characterized by massive casualties. It would see several important and notable figures, the likes of Mikhail Kutuzov, Barclay de Tolly, Michel Ney, and several others. Numerous troops had been involved in the fighting, and prior to the Battle of Borodino, the invasion of Russia had been underway for months. The Russian army had been using their own strategy in order to slow down the French advance, and the French forces would lose several troops to the conditions at hand and the shortages that existed. The Battle of Smolensk would occur during this general period. One of the changes that came after the battle was the replacement of Barclay de Tolly with Kutuzov, a general who would continue to gain compliments and play a large role in the fight against the French. In the general period as well, preparations would be made by Kutuzov's army. Prior to the battle as well, the Russian army would undergo many changes, some of them in response to the losses they had endured, like the Battle of Austerlitz. Another event that had occurred had been the Battle of Marengo, a battle that ended with French victory and had involved several individuals and seen fierce fighting. It would see the involvement of the French Republic, on whose side were individuals the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Desaix, and Jean-Lannes, as well as the Habsburg monarchy, on whose side was Michael Melas. At the end of the fighting there would be negotiations, which would see the involvement of Melas and would see the Austrians withdraw from some of the regions they were in. Events at the Battle of Eylau would involve conflicts between forces under Bennigsen and the French troops. It would be a fierce battle that would be hampered in some way by the weather. It would see massive casualties on either side. Present during the battle would be several significant individuals who would continue to play varied roles in the way the events unfolded on the day, in a battle that would involve formations, strategies, and conflicts in a complex web of events that would see the lives of several and numerous individuals influenced. Whether they were there on the battlefield, actively participating in the conflict, or they were home taking part in the war. The fate of many would depend on some of the actions that would occur at the Battle of Eylau, and some of the events would have an aftermath that would continue to have an effect on many other events and situations. Following the events of the Battle of Eylau, the Battle of Heilsberg would occur sometime after. It would play its own part in the Napoleonic Wars. It would also follow other events like the Siege of Danzig, which had seen the involvement of Friedrich Adolf Graf von Kalkreuth, as well as the French represented by individuals like Lefebvre. Other events that had occurred in the past also included the Battle of Friedland, which would see the involvement of the French and the Russian empires in a conflict that would end in French triumph. The events would occur sometime in June and would see the involvement of several individuals, amongst them Michel Ney and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and on the Russian side, individuals like Bennigsen. The victory would eventually see the Russians retreat. Negotiations would occur after, and the treaties of Tilsit would result. Territorial changes would also occur in their aftermath. The soldiers' morale following some of the events above would factor into the course the Russians would decide to take. They would therefore look for a battleground for the upcoming conflict. Borodino would be an important village and site for the Battle of Borodino. The area chosen would have both limitations and advantages. Kutuzov would order for preparations to occur. The Battle of Shevardino would occur in the time before the Battle of Borodino and would see the Russian lines move from where they had been initially positioned to another location. There would be a justification behind this move, and it was not entirely random. Fighting would commence at some point in time in the Battle of Borodino and would be met by fierce conflicts. Events would see the Russian forces move back to the Kolorskoye cloister. They would change positions at other points in the fighting, and the conflict would see fierce and difficult fighting occur with several casualties on both sides. The French would be able to capture some positions. The battle would therefore end with the defeat of the Russian forces and a victory for the French. During the battle, Kutuzov would have some of his forces placed in strong positions. Napoleon would make some mistakes. Fierce fighting would occur, and several injuries would be incurred. Amongst the injured would be individuals the likes of Dezay, as well as a man called Campan. Several positions would be gained by the French. In the aftermath of the fighting, the Russians would retreat and Moscow would be occupied by the French. But things wouldn't be as straightforward as that, as some of the decisions Napoleon would make in the aftermath of the Battle of Borodino would negatively impact his future. Battle of Leipzig, 1813. Fought over many days in October of 1813. The events would transpire at Leipzig, which was in the Kingdom of Saxony at the time. It would see the participation of several nations, amongst who were nations like Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Some of them had been involved in the other coalition wars that had preceded this one. The Battle of Leipzig would be a fateful event that would end in the victory of the coalition. It would change many things for Napoleon and for France. It would also see forces from several countries work together against a French army that had been reduced and was relatively weaker than at other points in time in the war. Some of the nations participating in the battle would include Russia, Austria, France, Saxony, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and many others. Numerous soldiers would be present. Some of them on the French side would be from the nations that France had conquered. Also present or involved in the conflicts would be persons like Karl von Schwarzenberg, Michel Ney, Edward Mortier, Napoleon, Joachim Murat, and Gebhard von Blücher. Numerous casualties would be sustained on both sides. And in the aftermath, France would be the destination for Napoleon. The following months would be eventful in the grand scheme of things. Prior to the events at Leipzig, the Battle of Borodino had taken place as a part of the French conflict with Russia. It ended in victory for the French and in massive territorial losses for Russia. But the battle would also be characterized by massive casualties. It would see several important and notable figures participating in it, the likes of Mikhail Kutuzov, Barclay de Tolly, and Michel Ney. Numerous troops would be involved in the fighting. Before the Battle of Borodino, the invasion of Russia had been underway for months. The Russian army had been using their own strategy in order to slow down the French advance. And the French forces had lost numerous troops to the conditions at hand and the shortages that existed. Moscow would be occupied, then set aflame, but things would go badly for France as they would find the conditions averse to them, the harsh winter dwindling their numbers as well as short supplies, illnesses, and attacks. The Battle of Vittoria would occur. In it, the coalition would be involved in a conflict that would see them emerge the successful party and had seen the involvement of notable individuals on the French side, the likes of Joseph Bonaparte and several others. The outcomes of the Battle of Vittoria would add to the challenges that Napoleon was facing. The battle had taken place sometime in June of 1813, and many of its events would center around and occur in Vasconia, Spain. In the Battle of Leipzig, numerous forces would come together against France, and things would look worse and worse. The French people were also not at ease with events that had occurred, and conditions within France were not ideal. The army that Napoleon would gather would have its weaknesses, amongst which was youth and inexperience. but Napoleon would still create plans. Prior to the battle as well, a battle at Lutzen and another at Bautzen had taken place. Events would see a relatively short armistice take place, which would also see several individuals meet and discuss plans against the French and against Napoleon. A plan known as the Trachenberg Plan would come to form as a result of some of these discussions, and several armies would be formed. In command of some of these forces would be personalities like Gebhard von Blücher, who had been present in many of the previous battles. Crown Prince Charles John, Carl Philipp the Prince of Schwarzenberg, and Count Benigsen were also in charge of some of the other armies. The French would emerge triumphant from the Battle of Dresden, which had taken place in August and had seen people like Napoleon Bonaparte, Auguste de Marmont, Barclay de Tolly, and Tsar Alexander. It was a conflict that would involve numerous soldiers on both sides and result in several casualties. Other battles would also occur at various sites like Kulm and Dennewitz. They would meet with some triumph for the coalition. And some troops would change sides and loyalties, moving from the French side. This and many other factors would contribute to the situation that Napoleon would now find himself prior to the battle. The Battle of Graubünden would come about and would see defeat for the French. The fighting had transpired sometime in August and had seen the involvement of individuals like Jean Reynier and Nicolas Oudinot, as well as that of several soldiers in a conflict that would occur in Graubünden. Ney, von Bülow, and Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte would be involved in the conflicts at the Battle of Dennewitz, which would see the French emerge with a defeat, and this would have further harmful effects on the French. Forced into moving and then crossing the Elbe, Leipzig would become a region that many of the events that would occur would center around. Preparations would be made. The Allies' forces would be more than those on Napoleon's side. In the battle, many forces would be present, including some that were part of the Confederation of the Rhine. Some of the situation that had presented itself now had been due to the Allies and their following of the Trachenberg Plan. The army under Napoleon wasn't at its greatest strength. The numbers on the French side would be less than those opposing them, but Napoleon would still try to better his position, and some things would be in his favor. Michel Ney and Auguste de Marmont would be present at these battles, so too would be individuals like Marshal Pierre Augereau. On the coalition side, some prominent leaders would be present and would play an active role in the events of the battle. Several individuals would be involved in the planning, and the plan would involve primary and secondary attacks. But the plan would have its detractors, amongst whom was Alexander, who thought there would be limitations within it and saw aspects that Napoleon could use to his clear advantage. A new plan would be drafted. Some events that would occur in the course of the fighting would somewhat justify the ideas and opinions that he had made. Fighting would occur on the 16th of October, with additional forces expected to join both the French and the Allies' side. Several events would occur at Markkleeberg and at Dölitz. Some of the events that would occur at Markkleeberg would involve a bridge. At some point in time, Markkleeberg would be taken by Poniatowski, who had been involved in several other events over the course of the battle and fighting. Events at Wachau would see the involvement of the Russians, the French, and the Prussians, and would see clashes between the forces. Other areas that would be of interest would be Liebertwolkwitz, which would see Marshal MacDonald involved in the defense. It would also see the involvement of several persons and soldiers. Amongst some of them would be the likes of General Lauriston, in a location that would see some clashes. It would also see an Austrian attack, and saw some undertakings that would win acclaim by the general known as General Württemberg. General Drouot would act on behalf of Napoleon, and some of his actions would be successful. Over some of the course of the battles and fighting, some situations would develop that Napoleon could use. The fighting would last quite some time and would see several casualties. Lindenau would see the French involved in a fight for which their involvement would have some negative effects for another of the fights they'd be engaged in. The 17th would bring with it some events. Some reinforcements would be received as well, something that had been somewhat expected in the course of events. At some point in time, Napoleon would consider withdrawing and would send one individual by the name of Mervelt with a letter to several of the Allies' leaders. Many factors had added to make his position a difficult one, and at this point in time he would send an offer to yield some locations to the Allies. An offer that would eventually find itself not being accepted in general by the Allied leaders who had received it. Napoleon in the general period had been making some considerations and had been thinking on his options. The Allies would attack, and many of the directions would have the Allies' forces. Several events would occur at Wachau, Dalitz, Probstheide, Ponsdorf, Schönefeld, and at other positions. Probstheide would see the Allies attack trying to gain positions, but they would meet resistance, and some of their attempts would be unsuccessful. Present in the fighting here would also be General Rayski, who had been active at the Battle of Borodino. Fighting would continue, and several individuals and events would be involved in it. At some point, Alexander would have requests made of him by Schwarzenberg after some of the events that had taken place over the course of the fighting here. At Lindenau, some Austrian troops would be pushed away by French forces, which had had an effect on some of the successes that the Allies had been able to achieve. Some discussions that had occurred at a conference had also seen some action agreed that would take place at Parthe River. However, at some point in battle, some troops would defect to the coalition, which would have some negative impact, causing the French to retreat from some areas. Many casualties would be endured in the conflict, and ammunition was increasingly running out. Given the current situation, several positions would be retreated from by the French. An evacuation would be undertaken, though, with attempts at not letting the coalition know that the retreat was occurring. The coalition would at some point in time find out about the French withdrawal and would then move to respond to it. Many casualties would be endured and many troops would be captured when an attempt to destroy a bridge the French were using, by the French themselves, would occur at the wrong time. Many casualties had been endured in the fighting of the battle. The defeat here would be damaging for Napoleon. It would add to the collection of defeats that he had had, and would somewhat be an early prototype of some of the other defeats that would befall him as the course of the wars went on, and more disadvantages accumulated on the French side. Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Scene in 1815. The Battle of Waterloo would be a famous battle that would end in defeat for Napoleon and would follow other battles like the Battle of Leipzig, which had been fought over many days in October of 1813. The events that would occur at Leipzig, which was in the Kingdom of Saxony at the time, would see the involvement of several nations, amongst who were nations like Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Some of them had been involved in the other coalition wars that had preceded this one. It would be a fateful event that would end in the victory of the coalition. It would also change many things for Napoleon and for France. It would see forces from several countries work together against a French army that had been reduced and was relatively weaker than at other points in time in the wars. Some of the nations involved in the battle would include Russia, Austria, France, Saxony, the United Kingdom, and Sweden, as well as many others. Numerous soldiers would be present. Some of them on the French side would be from the nations that France had captured. Also present in the conflicts would be individuals like Karl von Schwarzenberg, Michel Ney, Edward Mortier, Napoleon, Joachim Murat, and Gebhard von Blücher. Numerous casualties would be sustained on both sides, and in the aftermath, France would be the destination for Napoleon. The following months after the Battle of Leipzig would be eventful. The Battle of Waterloo now would see several nations involved, including the United Kingdom, Prussia, France, and several others. It would also see the involvement of the Duke of Wellington, as well as individuals like Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher. It followed events like the exile of Napoleon and his return to France, as well as battles like the Battle of Ligny, which had seen the involvement of individuals like Gebhard von Blücher and Graf von Zieten in a battle that eventually ended in French victory. The Battle of Waterloo here would end in French defeat, which would have consequences for Napoleon. Its events would occur and center around Waterloo and would occur around June of 1815. This marks the end of the timeline for events in Napoleon's life for now, as well as the Revolutionary Wars. Several people would play a role in Napoleon's life, including his spouses Josephine de Beauharnais and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon would drastically change policies within France. Areas he would come to change would include the legal system, the financial system, education, and the army. Some of the changes he would oversee saw differences in the way France was governed and those who had a role in governing it. Under it, some people would gain power and influence and other individuals would lose it or become less relevant. The Conseil d'État would be a part of the government that would come to have a role in several events. During his lifetime, the Napoleonic codes would also come into existence. They would have a wide influence, impacting several aspects of French life and changing the way things had been for several centuries before them. Many individuals would be impacted by their contents. They touched on several aspects, and many individuals would be involved in their creation, with several events taking place in their creation. Their influence would be seen in many other corners of the world as they shaped and impacted other nations and how they came to construct or build their own codes or constitutions. Other things that Napoleon would have a role in would include reforms within France that touched on many aspects of French life. Some of these aspects would include, but would not be limited to, issues to do with the economy and finances, whilst others were to do with education and how individuals would be educated within the nation. His influence as an individual would also see itself being expressed within the world of the military and military affairs, with some of the battles that he would be involved in being remembered to various extents for the ability that was exemplified over their course. That marks the end of the last episode into the history of Napoleon Bonaparte for now. If you enjoyed this series, please take the time to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos and to see other topics explored.